Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts.
Architecture is what defines the look of a city. And this month on Access Minnesota, we explore why and how Minneapolis looks the way that it does. Later in the show, we'll talk with Brita Bloomberg from the Minnesota Historical Society about preserving the state's architectural history. And art critic Camille Lefevre runs down the 5 most interesting buildings in Minneapolis. But first, Professor Thomas Fisher discusses the lasting impact the architect Ralph Rapson left on the Twin Cities. Tom Fisher is a professor and dean of the School of Architecture in the College of Design at the University of Minnesota. Professor Fisher, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Glad to be here.
Today we're talking about Ralph Rapson. What is his legacy as an architect, and more specifically, what is his legacy in Minnesota?
Well, our college sits in Rapson Hall, named after Ralph Rapson, and so he has had a tremendous impact on the architecture and design community here in the Twin Cities. When he came here from MIT to become the head of the School of Architecture, in many ways he brought modern architecture with him. Although there were some architects in the Twin Cities who were practicing modern architecture, it really was not the kind of dominant mode of practice. And so when Ralph came here, he brought with him a lot of ideas that were current not only in the East Coast. He had been at MIT, he had been at the new Bauhaus School, but also he was very well aware of what was happening in Europe. And so essentially I think of him as having established modern architecture here in Minnesota right after World War II and right at the beginning of the 1950s boom in development.
Rapson headed the School of Architecture at the university for 30 years. What did his leadership leave in terms of legacy for both the school and its students?
One of the main things that Ralph did was establish a very strong connection to the practitioner community here. And as a result, the school has always had and still has a large number of adjuncts, people who are practicing in the cities and come teach. And for a professional school, such as our School of Architecture, that's a real strength in that we are sitting right in the middle of one of the big architecture and design communities in the country. And Ralph continued that tradition over the 30 years that he headed the school that we have carried on. So I think this ability for students to come to Minnesota and not only have top flight traditional full-time faculty doing all of the interesting research that they do, but also this ability to study with people who are practicing at the moment has really made the University of Minnesota School of Architecture always one of the top-rated schools in the country.
Cedar Riverside Plaza on the west bank of the university campus is certainly one of the most visible pair of buildings in the Twin Cities. When they were constructed back in the 1970s, the intention was to have people of varying income levels living under one roof. Today, though, it has nicknames like the crack stacks, and many consider the multicolor panels on the building to be a bit of an eyesore. What were Rapson's intentions with the complex, and why does it get a bad reception today?
Well, the Cedar Riverside development was a part of an experimental Newtown in Town program that the Department of Housing and Urban Development did back actually in the 60s, and it lapsed over into the early 70s. And it was partly an effort to create a complete city inside the city, so that you would have your shopping, your grocery stores, you would have a mix of incomes and a mix of housing types. So if you had kids, you could move into townhouses. And Ralph actually took those ideas even further. So for example, the colored panels that you referred to were really what the remnant of an idea that he had, which was that everybody should be able to customize the outside of their apartment. so that if you liked shutters on your windows and flower boxes, you should be able to do that, which is a very different idea than most apartment buildings where the exteriors are all pretty much uniform and everyone's window looks alike. The owners didn't go for that idea, thought there would be too much maintenance involved in everybody having a different exterior to their apartment, but Ralph was very concerned to try to personalize and customize living in a 40-story building. So I think that the ideas of mixed income, the ideas of the ability to have schools and shops and offices, everything close by, were all quite innovative. And a lot of those innovations were either not acceptable to the federal government or the owners did not go for them. And so in some ways I see Cedar Riverside as a really interesting experiment that was not fulfilled. And on the other hand, I think it has served populations in the city very well. You know, right now it's of course largely occupied by people from Somalia and Ethiopia. I mean, there's a very large African community there, and it has been, I think, quite effective as a place for immigrant communities coming into the Twin Cities to have a sense of community among themselves as they attempt to get established here in the Twin Cities. So I think as well, it was very dense. We don't have much housing quite that dense. I mean, other parts of the country, New York City obviously does, but so I think it isn't very common, and I think as a result many Minnesotans look at that and say, I wouldn't live in a 40-story concrete building. That said, I think that will continue to be very desirable housing and will in the future be even more desirable than it is now. We just have to wait again for the gas prices to go back up to $4 and $5 a gallon, as they will. And the ability to live so close to the downtown, you can almost walk to the downtown, you can walk to the university, walk to hospitals. I think people will realize that there were a lot of smart aspects to it, and I think it will get rediscovered.
One of Rapson's most famous buildings, the original Guthrie Theater, has been torn down. Does this in any way indicate that Rapson's vision is not weathering the test of time?
Well, a number of Ralph's best buildings have been torn down. The Pillsbury House was also torn down, unfortunately. And I don't know. I mean, I think the reason the Guthrie was demolished is a complicated story. I do think that it in part had to do with budget cuts. That was a very inexpensive building to build. And so the exterior was built out of wood and stucco, and it didn't last. That wasn't Ralph's choice. He wanted a more permanent material. So the budget cuts when the building was built led to its early decay. Eventually they had to replace the exterior elevations of the original Guthrie Theater. As well, budget cuts, they lopped off space in the backstage area, so there was never enough backstage space. This is always one of the challenges architects have, is that clients are under pressure to bring, buildings into budget, and yet sometimes they can make cuts that over the long term really work against the ability for the facility to function well. So I don't think it has really anything to do with the architecture. I think the theater was well loved. In fact, there was a preservation protest to its demolition. And certainly when the new Guthrie Theater was built, one of the instructions to that architect, Jean Nouvel, is that the thrust theater in the new Guthrie essentially mimic the Ralph Rapson theater, thrust stage theater. So it was so well liked, not only by the audience and the people of Minnesota, but by the Guthrie Theater itself. So I think that Ralph, the theater was one of the first asymmetrical thrust stage theaters in the country and started a trend that became very popular. So it was historically important from the history of theater point of view as well as architecturally. And so even though the building is gone, which is really unfortunate, its legacy still lives on in the new building.
If Rabson were still alive today, what sort of projects do you think he would be championing here in the Twin Cities?
Well, a project that he was working on right up to the day he died was a really interesting glass building for the Minnesota Arboretum. And it was basically a really interesting greenhouse that he worked with mathematicians to develop a really efficient structure to build this with, and it was unable to get funded while Ralph was alive, although I still hoped someday this community would build that structure, in part recognizing that they had one of the 20th century's greatest architects living and working here for almost his entire career. And I think it's really a shame that we didn't recognize his importance internationally and allowed some of his best buildings to be torn down. Maybe we could actually build one of his designs that didn't get built while he was alive and recognize him in that way.
Tom Fisher, Dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Minnesota, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thank you.
When Access Minnesota returns, Brita Bloomberg from the Minnesota Historical Society talks about preserving the state's architectural history.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.